The fertility rates in the West are at an all-time low. And as Christians, we know that children are a blessing, but people just aren't having children today. It's causing real problems for our nation. But what happens when you're one of the few who actually want children, but by God's providence and decree, you're not able to have them? So how should you think about that? How should you think about fertility treatments, and in particular, in vitro fertilization? On this episode, I'm going to discuss with a fellow pastor of my Presbytery, Ben Sulser, all about these issues. And so join me as I build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.
Rise up, for men of God, have done with lesser. Rise up, for men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind, soul and strength, and serve the King of Kings. Lift high the cross of Christ, tread where His feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God.
Psalm 139, 13 through 16 says, "For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." My name is Pastor Joseph Spurgeon, and you are listening to the Patriarchy Podcast, a ministry of Sovereign King Church. I am very glad to be back with you. It's been a little while. Been putting out some recordings from our conference that we had a while back, and I hope you've been enjoying those. But it is good to be back with you. Today, I have a special guest, and we're here to talk about a topic that actually has been in the news somewhat frequently here recently, especially with the election. And there was a judgment in Alabama that would have provided protection to children in the womb. And the topic of in vitro fertilization, fertility treatments, came up, and that was a huge deal. So it's something that's been in the news, but people often are not thinking biblically correctly about it, or not even knowing what to think. So I do have a guest with me who's very knowledgeable and personally knowledgeable on this topic, and I'll be glad to have him here. And so welcome to the Patriarchy Podcast to Ben Sulser. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Joseph. Glad to be here.
Ben, you are a pastor in Evangel Presbytery and the director of mentoring for New Geneva Academy.
Yes, sir.
What is that? Just tell us a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, New Geneva Academy is the place where I was trained to be a pastor. It had a different name back in that day, but it is it's a program focused not just on academics, but on the practical side of training men. And so that's why there is such a thing as a director of mentoring, because we want men to have practical training. We want them to be mentored by a pastor or elder that who believes in their potential for shepherding Christ's sheep. And so the program's put together so that guys can stay in their local church, wherever that is, and do video classes and some live events too, but have the academic training, but with the benefit of staying in their church and doing work and getting trained and being evaluated. And we help that process go forward so that men can get ready for the ministry.
Yeah, I'm actually quite jealous of some of the men that I've seen go through. There's a man in my church going through it. So I went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I really enjoyed seminary. God used it greatly in my life. Wouldn't necessarily trade that experience for anything, except for if I could have went to New Geneva Academy, because I like one of the things that seminaries do is they work on your theological training.
Mm-hmm.
They work on your knowledge, teaching you how to learn, how to preach, how to study at least to preach, and but one of the things they don't really work on is, and it's really just the factor of the model, is your personal character and how that may impact your work as a pastor. And so, getting on the ground training in a congregation while also getting good theological training is pretty good. So, I guess that's my plug for New Geneva Academy, and I know Ben would encourage you as I would if you're interested, want to become a pastor. Where do they go for that, Ben?
Sure. Yeah, they can go to newgenevaacademy.com, and there are links to find out more. There's links to contact us. There's links to apply. But you can read about the program. You can see the curriculum. You can see the costs. We are pretty cheap, I have to say, and we want to keep it that way so that guys who God is calling can afford to go through.
All right. Well, hey, Ben, I have a question for you. I always like to ask my guest a really vital, important question right at the very beginning.
All right. I'm ready.
You're Jewish, right?
I'm not. Not that I know of.
Okay. Well, shoot.
Sorry, man.
Well, yeah, man. I thought we were having God's chosen people here. So, no. I asked the question because I thought you were. I don't know where I heard that at for the longest time. I think
Oh, really?
Pastor Tim Bailey said something.
Oh, man, that's funny.
And so I assumed that.
My aunt
But
on my mom's side is always like, "Are you sure you're not Jewish?" She likes to joke about
well,
that.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't matter. But anyways, now we got the important things out of the way.
Okay.
I have a real serious question.
Oh, all right.
You're married? You got children?
We got children. Yep.
How many children do you have?
We have twins, and we have one more boy on the way.
All right. So you're going to have 3 boys.
Well, the twin boy and girl.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and one boy on the way. So we'll have 2 boys and a girl.
Nice. What's the names? What's the
Yeah, our twins are Torin, that's the boy's name, and Maudie. Maudie is short for Magdalene. It's a nickname for Magdalene. And we do have a name picked out for the baby, but we don't tell anyone.
See, I was trying to get that out. That's what I was trying to do.
I see that.
So, speaking of children and your children, there's something pretty unique in regards to your children, and so
Yeah.
it has to do with why we're having you on the show to begin with.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, our children are adopted, but they weren't adopted through traditional adoption. In other words, we didn't get in touch with an adoption agency that got in touch with parents of a newborn infant or something, and adopt them as infants. We adopted them as embryos, which more and more people I think are becoming aware of as a thing. So my wife, even though they're adopted, my wife gave birth to them, and that, of course, brings us in touch with a world that we're going to be talking about, the world of fertility technology, IVF in particular.
Yeah. So, that's just. I want to ask some basic questions.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be using these terms, it's helpful to define it. Yes. What is an embryo? If you have somebody who hadn't been in health class for a long time, what is it?
An embryo is a fertilized egg. It's the result of a sperm fertilizing an egg. It is the start of a human life, a new human life that God made.
And human life begins after that embryo implants into the womb?
No, although, what is it? The American College of Gynecologists or Obstetrics, I can't remember, redefined it that way in the 60s, I think. But no, it begins at conception, at fertilization. It doesn't begin at implantation. Implantation is just the point at which the embryo has traveled up the fallopian tube into the womb and implanted. But it's not the period. It's fertilization is the point at which there's a complete set of genetic data for a new person, and there's no other place really to go for the start of human life. You could. Every other line you want to draw is arbitrary.
So you're saying then that when your children then were not fertilized by you, but they were
Right.
how did they come to life?
Yes. Well, that's where IVF comes in. So IVF stands for in vitro fertilization, which is Latin for fertilized in glass, like fertilized in a test tube or a petri dish. These little babies who came into the world this way used to be called test tube babies, because what you do is you harvest eggs from a woman, and you take sperm from a man, and you put together egg and sperm in a petri dish or something like that. And if they fertilize, there you go, you have an embryo that didn't come about the normal way, which is, of course, through sexual love, hopefully in marriage, but an embryo that came about in a laboratory process. And that kind of changes the whole way that you think about these tiny little children, because you're making them, and you've taken charge of the process of making them and disposing of them, doing whatever you're going to do with them.
Wait, you mean disposing of them?
Well,
What do you mean
I'm
by?
kind of actually, yeah. Let me be careful with my terms here. So, I mean it in the broadest sense. Like, it's kind of like if you die, there's questions about the disposition of all your possessions. What are we going to do with all this stuff? Some of it we might decide to give to Goodwill. Some of it might go to your heirs. Some of it we might be like, that's just trash, we're throwing it away. So the disposition of embryos, what I mean is anything and everything that could be done with them, whether that is, in fact, throwing them away like trash, which does happen, whether it is, in fact, donating them to science, which means science will kill them in order to advance its research, whether that is just storing them for years, even decades, in a freezer, a cryopreservation tank, or whether it is implanting them, transferring them into a mother's womb with the hope that they will implant in the uterine wall and result, that they'll become live. Sorry, the terms are hard here. With the hope that the mom will be able to give birth to them. So in that very broad sense, you're determining what happens to them. You're disposing of the embryos, but you may also be, when we say disposing, I know we mean throwing away. You may also be doing that, and that depends upon the parent's choice, and also the choice of the embryologist, the scientist who's creating these little people, so to speak. I use that word advisedly, and we can talk more about that, because we know only God creates human life. But anything and everything that you could do, suddenly we are the ones determining, because we've removed the start of life from natural processes and from its normal context in sexual love and in the womb. We've taken control of it. And that means that suddenly we're making all these choices that mothers and fathers didn't have before.
It kind of sounds like something out of like a sci-fi thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
so this obviously is new technology, I'm guessing. How long has this
Yeah.
thing been going on?
All right. Well, so the first test tube baby, the first baby born through IVF, was Louise Brown, a little British baby in 1978. Louise Brown was born to protest. People protested her birth. They didn't think it was right. Public sentiment thought that this work was sort of like the work of Dr. Frankenstein, creating something that men ought not to tamper with, playing God. And there was even a bomb threat after Louise was born. It turned out to be a hoax, but it scared Louise's mother and father, as you might imagine.
Sure.
So there was genuine hostility. There was opposition, not just in a general public sense, but there was opposition from the scientific community. There was opposition from the Roman Catholic Church. I wish I could say there was opposition from the Protestant Church. I don't know if there was. Maybe there was, but we've been playing catch up for a long time to the Roman Catholics in terms of their thoughtfulness and care about what the Bible teaches about life and procreation and sexuality. And so that was Louise Brown, and from there, people got more and more used to the idea, and the scientific community, as it saw that. Well, maybe I should back up a little.
Well, I got a
Go
question.
Yeah.
It's just a curious
Yeah.
question. You said Louise Brown?
Yes,
A girl?
a girl. Yeah.
Is she still alive?
Oh man, that's a good question. Let me check here. Oh man, she is. Yes, she's still alive.
Okay.
Mhm. She's only right. No,
She'd be about 45, 46.
There you go.
something
You
like
got
that.
it. Yeah, she's 46. She has 2 children. One fear was that, well, IVF, if you create a baby this way, the child's going to be abnormal. They may not even be able to have children. Well, Louise Brown had children. And so the scientific community said, oh, well, I guess this is all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's still around.
But, well, we'll get. I was about to ask about the frozen embryos thing, but we'll get into that. I was going to jump ahead, but I'll hold that question. So she's the first to be born.
First to be born. Yeah.
How many attempts do you know? Do you know how many attempts it took to get there? How did we get there?
There were hundreds. So the doctor who oversaw this, medical miracle, to be not serious about it, this technological breakthrough, let's call it that, because that's true. It's an amazing technological breakthrough. Was named Robert Edwards. He's now dead. Robert Edwards was a British scientist who first studied animal embryology, and he was interested in human embryology. He was interested in the thought of creating babies for IVF, but he wasn't interested at first for the sake of helping infertile couples have babies, right? He was interested at first because he was like, well, if I can do this in animals, he spent a lot of time working with mice and doing IVF on mice, right? As he was honing these techniques. He published apparently 38 papers just in the 50s while he was working with mice. That's a lot of papers. Like, this guy was very, very motivated and very excited. And I want to come back to his motivations, because I think they're important in kind of thinking about what IVF is and what it means, because we can read about what it meant to this scientist, Robert Edwards. But anyway, Robert Edwards was doing into this, the 50s. 50s is when Watson and Crick had just established that, hey, guess what? DNA carries all the genetic information. So it was an exciting time for genetics. It's like we're really figuring out the secrets of who and what we are as human beings, Robert Edwards is fascinated by all this. He's doing these studies with mice, and he is looking ahead to, like, okay, I want to do this stuff with human beings. I want to do it with human beings. Now, why? If not for infertility, which you might think now, because IVF is known as a treatment. That's a misnomer, by the way. I don't think it should be properly called a treatment, but it's known as a treatment for infertility, right?
What should it be called?
That's a good question. I think it should be called. I don't know. It circumvents the problem of infertility, right? It gets around it, but it doesn't treat infertility. I don't know what you call that. Just a medical technology that
It doesn't solve the infertility itself.
no, and that's right, and it's not aimed at solving infertility. It's aimed at bypassing infertility, and the way that it does that is part of what I think is the main moral and ethical problem. I should just start saying this phrase because it's the way that I want people to think about IVF as they think biblically, which is that it's a way of playing God. You know, God built us a certain way to have kids, a certain way. He didn't put us directly in charge of the sperm and the eggs, right? We didn't learn to harvest eggs from a woman's body for a long time because it's very invasive. But when you kind of like I was saying at first, when you take this process over, and then you begin to think of these little kids that you created in the lab as products. Well, we'll throw this one away. Oh, that one died. Oh well. Well, we're going to freeze these until the parents are ready to have them. Well, that's the way that you treat property. And so, no matter, even if you think, well, IVF is a godsend. Millions of kids have been born through IVF, and that means millions of infertile couples have had the joy of children. And how could you say no to that? I say, well, you're not looking at the hidden cost. You're not looking even at the hidden cost to the souls of the parents. But let me come back to that if that's okay. That's kind of
Let's come
just
back.
So much stuff.
I know it's like we want to dive right in. And I kind of want to get more of that history,
Sure.
And then we'll dive into some of the ethical. You already let us know where we're going.
Yeah, I let you know where we're going.
That's
so, okay. Well, so Robert Edwards wants to do this stuff because he's interested in basically genetic testing. That's why he wants to get to human IVF. Hey, can we figure out the onset of Down syndrome and other syndromes? Okay, you're like, well, okay. Why is he interested in that? Well, Robert Edwards, by some point in the 60s, had become a full-fledged eugenicist. He was interested in genetic testing because he thought we ought to control the genetic destiny of the human race. Now, I know that at some point, maybe in the 50s or early 60s, when he was first beginning to think through the ethics of what he was getting into, he tried, I don't even know what this means, but I know he tried Christianity. I know he visited churches.
Okay.
This is part of his biography. And he came out of that trial phase 100% opposed to God and religion, fully of the mindset that man is the measure of all things, and we should be able to do whatever we want to do in the lab and with human beings. And he did, because as he began to do these, as he began to do experiments in order to develop IVF, this was still frowned on by the scientific community at large because, what's funny is that some of the opposition to this is some of it is understandable, some of it is completely blind, and some of it is evil. If you're talking about the opposition in the scientific community, I think it's understandable for the scientific community of the time to say, hey, this seems like experimentation on women, on mothers. You're harvesting their eggs or their ovarian tissue, and it's unnatural. It's like you're experimenting on them. I think okay, yeah, I see that. And then they're also well, and they don't have anything to say about the babies except that they're worried that the babies might be, monsters, they might be deformed, right?
Yeah,
that's all they have to say. They're not thinking of treating children as commodities. the problem of playing God. But then the other reason that they don't want IVF at the time is because they're like, we don't want infertile couples to be able to have babies this way. Like, we need population control, man. We're trying to reduce the population, not increase it. So that's another reason they were opposed, which is terrible.
Yeah.
All right, so you have all of this awful stuff anyway, and Edwards becomes fully anti-Christian, anti-God, also becomes a socialist, also becomes a eugenicist. The Eugenics Society, which was started by Francis Galton at the turn of the 20th century, or somewhere in there, early 20th century, was later renamed the Galton Institute in the 90s. And then now it exists as the, I had to look this up again because I had forgotten. It exists as the, where is it? Hold on. I'm going to find this. The Adelphi Genetics Forum. So it's still there in Britain. And people are still funding eugenics research in Britain and the United States, and don't think that they've ever stopped. They never have. It's just a note. This guy was all about.
Do they still call it that? Have they come up with a different name than eugenics?
I don't know. I haven't gone deep enough down the rabbit hole. I know that, I mean, you can read about some recent stuff, like Berkeley had a fund established in the 60s for eugenics research that only got like canceled and apologized for in the 2000s or maybe the 2010s. I was just reading an article about this, and it was still like faculty were getting email notices that, hey, this fund has a couple $1 million in it. If you're doing any eugenics research, let us know. So it's not. So I don't know. It seems that the term is still being used. So sometimes it's hidden, sometimes not. Robert Edwards was like a leader, though, in the eugenics, or the Galton Institute, and he was that through at least from the 60s through the 90s. You can find quotes from him in interviews like, "Hey, soon it will be a sin for parents to carry children with genetic disease." He also, well, I'll come back to another quote of him because his life here, and let me just, if I can go into a quick other rabbit hole, Joseph, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, dude. We're down.
All right, sir. Well, his life here, I don't know if it directly intersects with the life of a very different kind of scientist, a very different kind of man, a godly man who lived at the same time. I don't know if they ever directly cross paths. But you may have heard, and some of your listeners may have heard of Dr. Jerome Lejeune, who was a French Roman Catholic. He's famous for discovering how Down syndrome is caused, right? It's the reason that Down syndrome, he's the reason that Down syndrome is not called Mongolism anymore. That's what it used to be called. It used to be thought, well, Down syndrome happens because the mom is having sex outside of marriage. Maybe it's from syphilis. And so it had this weird stigma. If you had a Down syndrome child, well, that's the result of sin, basically, or the result of infidelity or something. But he discovered that it's caused by having a third copy of the 21st chromosome, and that's why the technical name for Down syndrome is now trisomy 21. And he won a ton of awards for this. And he was doing this research because he loved these children. He loved them. But it did not take him long to realize that what his discovery would be used for was to kill these patients before they were born through genetic testing. He realized this, right? He figured this out. He's a Christian man. And in a 1969 speech, so in the 60s, Robert Edwards is full bore with his IVF stuff, with his research. It's about 9 years before the birth of Louise Brown. But in his 69 speech, accepting the William Allen Award in the USA, which is this prestigious award for genetics, what he did was he used this speech, and he had colleagues telling him, dude, don't do this, don't do this. But what he did is he used his speech to talk about this science's ignorance of the actual start of human life and how the best that they could do, the best that we could do, was accept that it began at the moment of fertilization, and that no matter what approach you took, you couldn't really do better. And he was shaming his fellow scientists for wanting to abort children. He even went so far in this speech, which I've read and you can find online, in a very, well, he proposed, he said, yeah, given the way that things are going and all of that with genetic discoveries and stuff, I would like to propose a National Institute of Death. And here's what this National Institute of Death would do. It would decree on undesirable genes or chromosomes. It would deliver unhappy parents from unwanted pregnancies. It would discard embryos not fitting standard requirements. It would dispose of newborns not reaching minimal specifications of normalcy, and generally destroy, delete, or decry any human condition voted against by its board of advisors. And so he was doing this, of course, to rub his colleagues' noses in the fact that they were seriously overstepping their bounds and that this was what they were headed towards. And he really shocked people. And that was the end of his career. He was in line for the Nobel Prize. Dr. Robert Edwards, founder of IVF as we have it today, did win the Nobel Prize. Jerome Lejeune his career was over after this speech. He torched it. He used all of his influence to advocate for these helpless little people. And I mean, from that time on, he was blacklisted. He would get audited regularly by the government. He would he got a threat written on his lawn somewhere at some point saying, "Kill Lejeune and his little monsters." You know, the little monsters meaning the Down syndrome children. So this guy, well, anyway, I'll put a link in the show notes to that. But even better is his testimony in 1992, just a few years before he died. He testified. He flew into the United States again and testified. Testified at a court case about the disposition of embryos that had been created through IVF. And there was a couple, the Davises, who had IVF babies, and I don't remember what happened in their timeline, whether they had some of these children, but I know that while several of these children were still frozen, they got a divorce, or they were in the divorce process, and the question came up, what ought to be done? And the mother wanted to kill them, if memory serves, and the father wanted to save them. And Lejeune was brought in as an expert witness and testified that these were people, testified as a scientist, these are people. And he called the place where they were stored the concentration can. The concentration can. And the strength and warmth of his testimony is a beautiful thing. And you can read that transcript. It's quite something to read. The judge voted it down, and I believe the embryos were destroyed. The father lost the lives of his children. And in any case, that's Jerome Lejeune. But if you just to go back to Edwards for a second,
yeah,
in a 1971 article in the journal Nature, he talked about examining chromosomes to, quote, prevent the birth of individuals with genetic anomalies such as Mongolism, meaning Down syndrome children. So you have these two men, right, both involved in this world to some extent. And the Nobel Prize winner, who is lauded and remembered so well today, is the one who wanted to kill all the babies using this technology. So that's quite a contrast. I recommend reading about Jerome Lejeune. It's something.
Yeah.
But
so this For the doctor that invented this in
Yeah.
vitro fertilization,
Yeah.
and interestingly enough, he starts looking at Christianity. I wonder where he looked at.
Yeah.
I was I don't know if you. I've been paying attention to President Trump's inauguration, and then he went to
Hmm.
Episcopal church, supposed to be a prayer, a post inauguration prayer meeting today.
Okay.
And it was a woman who got up and went on this kind of woke thing, and all I can think of is here was President Trump and his whole family and JD Vance, and they get to sit there and listen to that garbage.
Man.
And no wonder, like if people were looking and that's what they discovered,
Right.
it's hard to blame them.
Right.
And so, but
Yeah,
so the
absolutely.
church has to. This is like another rabbit hole, but the
Sure.
church has work to do, and man,
Yeah.
I hate that is the Christians that are around our president have not been solid. Many of them have not
Yeah.
been, and so
Absolutely.
so you get, anyways. This guy goes looking. I don't know. Maybe he did find solid guys, and he just didn't. He rejected
Yeah.
it. But he goes looking, and then he decides, nope. I'm rejecting all that. We get to do what we want.
Yes.
We get to what? Play God? Does he ever say anything like that? Is there any kind of?
Yes. I mean, yeah, absolutely. He's in an interview from after, I think maybe a ways after his retirement. And I can put this link in the show notes too. He told the interviewer, quote, "I wanted to find out exactly who was in charge, whether it was God himself or whether it was scientists in the laboratory. It was us." So his whole perspective on why he was doing what he was doing, why he was so driven, right, is it's about being in charge of reproduction and the human race in place of God. Joseph, you asked a question that I didn't quite ever answer. You asked, how many tries did it take him to perfect this technique? So we know of about 500 documented instances, trials in which, if you just think of how science has to do all these trials and iterations to get the process right for anything it does, scientific engineering, and you think about what he was doing, well, every IVF trial requires first an egg, second a sperm. You have to fertilize them. And then if you successfully have a new human person there, then you must put them in the womb and see if they survive. So that's about 500 little people created that we know of. And then you ask, well, where did he get, the genetic material? Where did he get the male and female gametes? The answer is that he had the help of a woman gynecologist for years in Britain who was progressive and I think Marxist like he was, and helped him get ovarian tissue samples over the course of years from women who were not told what they would be used for. They were told it was for science, but not what it was. And so he was taking the eggs from these unknowing women, and then he was using his own sperm and the sperm of his colleagues, which means that over and over again, as these experiments failed, you could say, as these little children died, they were his children, and they were his colleagues' children, and they were these women's children being created and killed over and over in the laboratory. And it took a lot of lives, a lot of little lives, in order to create this technology.
Is Luis the baby that was
Yeah.
born? Is that his child too?
No. Louise was a genetic child of her parents. I don't remember their names, but
So he never succeeded then.
with one of his own. No, that's my
Yes.
understanding. But what's funny also is that Louise and her husband, or Louise's mother and father were not told. They were not told the full story of what was happening. They were told that this was an experimental procedure. They weren't told that it had never worked before. In other words, he kept the full truth from these people, even from the Browns, about what he was doing. And whether it had worked or any, he just didn't. We would say, I mean, there's a really dumb NBC article I found that just says the consent they got was lousy by today's standards. It was
Mhm.
pretty lousy. Um, all of this stuff tends to happen under the cover of darkness because it's dark stuff and it's messing with things that involve playing God.
Hmm. So he acknowledges that we're the ones that are doing this.
Yeah.
It's us.
Right.
Does he ever acknowledge that the failures are actually the death of children?
No, I don't think he did. I don't think he would. I mean, although actually, I shouldn't say that. I think that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think my guess is that he would look at embryos as sort of potential human beings, potential men and women, and because in any case, as a eugenicist, he believes we have, like it's sin not to deal with genetic abnormalities and problems, and so he believes in any case. I think it's fair to say in the right of parents to kill their children. Even if I just don't know that he would have felt the need to be entirely dishonest with himself. But I know he stood for abortion, just as he stood for um, killing embryos. We don't normally think of that maybe as abortion because we think of a fetus, when we think of abortion. But
Mm.
that's our mistake. Um, it's a child from its first moment of fertilization through its development in the womb. Um, so I'm not really sure entirely how he split the pie, but I just know that he believed firmly that parents ought to have a right, that they ought to kill children with genetic problems.
Well, let's move forward a little
Yeah.
bit. So he finally succeeds.
Yeah.
So there's been 500. I guess I don't want to move too
No,
fast.
that's fine.
I mean, 500
Yeah,
children
at least.
are, you wouldn't say intentionally killed, but what would you say? Negligently killed?
Yeah, something like that. It's like as soon as you take on the role of creating them, you've put yourself in a position to be responsible for their deaths, you know? So I don't know what you'd call that. I think I don't know. What is that? Second degree murder? I mean, once you
Yeah.
realize that you're doing it,
Homicide.
you're fully responsible.
Yeah. All right. So again, this is built on at least the backs of what we know of
Yeah.
500 human
Yeah,
beings.
at least. Probably more.
But then we get to success.
Yeah.
And then from there, what was a race from everybody trying to figure out how to do this? Is it
Yeah.
immediately becomes widespread? How is it? What happens?
Well, it's been a while since I've looked at the development from that point. I can tell you where we are now.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it caught him pretty quickly. From my memory of reading about this, but
Were the laws changed pretty quickly? Because
yeah,
was this illegal? Was this illegal? What was going on? Or
I don't think it was illegal. I think it was just frowned upon. I think the law didn't know how to regard it. I mean, in Britain, it's become regulated. I think pretty quickly it was regulated by the government. There's an agency that works with the government and keeps records, and the government holds it responsible to keep records, to keep tabs on all of these clinics, IVF clinics operating in Great Britain, and record how many embryos are created, how many cycles are done, how many attempts are made to do this, and how many are born, how many were thrown away, how many were
so that's
whatever.
in England.
That's in England.
And they're pretty liberal. So I'm assuming we have stricter regulations and laws.
Well, I wish, but we are. I mean, maybe true to the other American stereotype, we're more like the Wild West. We don't have any regulations. We don't have any laws. No one has to record how many embryos were created, how many resulted in live births, how many died. No one has to record this at all. And so we have some statistics from voluntary reporting. and we have estimates. For instance, the estimate of just how many little babies, embryo babies, are in the freezer right now in cryo tanks in America is 1 million or more. That, I'm sure that's a low estimate. No one really knows, and the lack of regulations is something that, well, there are lawsuits, I think, ongoing about it in the United States. But no, so Britain has done better than us in that regard. They are more civilized, that one particular.
So it takes off. It becomes known for fertility treatment. I think I mean, is there more about the history you want to say, or I want to talk about how it looks like now
Yeah,
for a man and a wife.
sure.
But anything else about the history of it that you wanted to?
No, I mean, I'll just say that, even, yeah, I think everything I have to say otherwise is about where we are now. So maybe we should just jump there.
Well, let's talk about now. So
Yeah.
what is the procedure now? Like, so
Right.
tell us how that works.
Yeah. So you go in, and if you're a married couple, let's say, then what's going to happen is that the woman has the expensive and invasive procedure of having her eggs harvested. Typically, this was done on a very large scale. So you might have 10, 20, 30 eggs harvested at a time. And then you take the husband's sperm, you try to fertilize all these eggs. And some of these embryos, some of the,
So is that
yeah.
a surgery for both the man and the woman?
No, it's not
or
a
how does-
surgery for the man. Sperm is, well, not to be, not to be gross or anything, but sperm is easier to get. So, but it is for the woman because eggs are not easy to get. And so then you fertilize them. You attempt to fertilize them, and sometimes it doesn't work. But then it works for a number of these. And then of those newly fertilized embryos, a number just don't make it. They just don't last for the number of days you're waiting to see if they'll develop slightly. And then some of those you transfer. Some of those, though, let me take a step back. Before you transfer them to the womb, we should talk about the question. We should talk about pre-implantation genetic testing, which is a technology that is downstream of IVF. It's downstream of the things Robert Edwards was doing in the lab. We have this technology because of what he did, and that lets you see if there's going to be genetic abnormalities. This testing is famously inaccurate for a lot of things. So, in other words, you might pay for this expensive testing to be done on your little embryos that you just had made in the lab. And the doctor might tell you, well, it looks like this one has this. And you might say, oh no, let's get rid of it. And then that might not have been true. So you have pre-implantation genetic testing. You might decide you want to know the sex of the embryos ahead of time. Because let's say you didn't want any girls, only boys. Well, throw the girls away. Or give the girls away. And so you might have an IVF lab where it's like, you come in with your wife and they're like, well, actually, you know what? We have these female embryos that this other family didn't want. Would you be interested? They're just kind of giving them away. So this is the world we live in, right? This really is like giving away puppies, or drowning kittens. It's the way that we treat animals.
How?
Yeah.
Maybe as a question for you.
Yeah.
Parents that are getting brought into this.
Yeah.
How much information is given to them so they actually know that we're dealing with human life and
well, no, I mean, these days, ever since the redefinition of conception, assigning the time to implantation instead of fertilization, our medical authorities have insisted that if if an embryo is created, if it dies before implantation, it was never a person. You know, it was what's called a pre-embryo, actually, not even an embryo. Now, this depends on who you're talking to or the kind of discussion you're having, but it's a pre-embryo before it's implanted. It's an embryo once it's implanted, and so parents are in the world of no, these aren't babies, these aren't people.
It's all very clinical, probably, right? Very medical term
Yeah,
based.
it's clinical, it's medical, and it's consumer driven, right? The parents, even if
Yeah.
they don't think of it this way, as soon as they pay money to have a child created, they are not thinking like parents anymore. They are thinking like consumers. And they will get to make decisions, like I was saying at the top of the show, about what to do with these little babies. In every way, the whole process inevitably leads the doctors and the nurses and the parents to treat these little people like property. That's what it leads them to, because you're going to say, well, we will transfer these to my wife's womb. And then you're going to say, well, we didn't want more than 2 kids. So now what do we do with the rest of these embryos? And you're going to decide their fate. And that is not how we, as Christians, that's not how we treat our children. We don't pretend like like Roman fathers used to do back in ancient Rome, that we have the right of life or death. If I want to execute my son or daughter, I will. It's within my legal rights as a parent to kill them. That's not that's that's not a right that God gave to parents. That's God's right, unless the children commit a crime, right?
Yeah.
But these children are being treated as property. And the whole process does that. You can say, well, no, I'm a Christian. I don't want to think of these kids as property. I think they're precious human beings. I want to have IVF because I want a baby. We want a baby. But the problem is that the whole process, everything is against you. You're choosing to have them created. You're choosing what to do with them. You can't escape that the relationship, the normal relationship of parent and child, has just changed for you.
Mm.
And because it's not a morally neutral technology. It's an evil technology. Um, I guess I just to go back real quick, Joseph, to the process. I mean, aside from the question of testing these embryos or not, you're going to have a bunch created, and depending on the kind of IVF you do, you might opt for a much smaller scale thing. Like it is possible these days, because we're advanced in our technology, to say, I just want to have one IVF baby created. Let's harvest one egg and fertilize it because we believe in the dignity of human life, or whatever you believe in. And we're not going to have spare embryos, but you're still choosing to have your baby created for money. And you're still putting that baby in a position where it may die, and you'll be responsible for that death if it does. Um, and so, but typically IVF creates a bunch of babies, a bunch of embryos, and then the wife might transfer 2 at a time, because the success rate is about 50% in terms of implantation to live birth, and you might choose to have 2 at a time to mitigate those odds, and the rest you'll freeze. And some of the embryos might die when you freeze them. You won't really know that till you thaw them. Some of them might die in the thawing process, and some, of course, are going to transfer to the wife's womb, but they're not going to implant for whatever reason. So they'll die, and then once you have, as they like to say in this world, once you've completed your family, which is a godless way of speaking, you will decide what happens to the remaining embryos. There are some that have been abandoned. We don't know how many. I mentioned earlier the legal case with Jerome Lejeune, and and the parents fighting over the lives of their unborn children. it is possible in a case like that for the children to be abandoned because neither parent will has the right perhaps to give to say what ought to happen to them, and so they just sit there in the freezer. No one has the right to get them out because they're property. They're not people, and the property owners haven't said what ought to be done.
How long can they stay in this cryogenic
We
state?
just don't know. The oldest surviving baby to be born after a stay in the freezer had been there for 30 years old, for 30 years, if memory serves. So, yes, 30 years frozen. We don't know the limits of cryopreservation.
Yeah.
It's
I'm curious what we were talking earlier, and I've been thinking about this. The first one is, what did you say, 46?
the first what?
Yeah, the first child born this way is 46 years old, right?
Oh
now.
yes, yeah, yeah.
So we don't even have data of any long-term
No
impact. And
no.
I'm assuming that baby was not frozen for that long.
I don't think she was frozen at all. I would assume that
Okay.
as soon as she was fertilized, they transferred her to her mother's womb.
I just wonder what we don't even know. It seems like the impact of somebody being frozen for 30 years, which means when they're born, I mean, in weird way, they're born 30 years old.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So
what does that have? Does that have an impact in the quality of their life? In the we don't know, man. That's a scary thing.
We don't know. It is, yeah. I mean, and this is happening all the time. Children are being born this way. Well, just to zoom out real quick to just a snapshot of where we are. There have been, by this time, a lot of children born through IVF. We don't, again, because of the lack of records, we don't know, but the estimate would be more than 8 million children across the world. And I've estimated based on the data from Britain, that there's a 14-to-1 ratio of dead children to born children if you're going through this process. And that means if there's been 8 million children born, there are 112 million dead because of this process. But that doesn't count all the children who are still frozen, of course.
I don't even know how to, when you start talking about the deaths of this or abortion,
right?
We just don't even have a mental category, because you think about the deaths of Nazis in World War II with the Nazis, whatever that number is. And then you think of like Stalin or in China or and like those numbers in of themselves are mind blowing, right? The number of people that died in World War II, I don't know right off the top of my head, but we're talking just with IVF deaths. If your number is in the ballpark, which I think it is, because I've also done some research on that, is more than those wars.
Right. Yeah.
And we think, obviously, we think how barbaric the Nazis, the communists that would do that. We think of them as never again. And yet we don't bat an eye about this happening. There's not even regulations, you're saying.
No, there's not regulations, and people haven't thought through it. They haven't thought through what's happening.
Well, so you have made some claims now that I want us to go back and I want you to prove for me. Okay. Show me. Okay.
You got it.
So, they're not claims about the numbers. They're claims about the ethics, the morality of this. So you've talked about playing God and how even just that in of itself is wrong.
Yeah.
We've talked about, life beginning at conception and then and so then from there, the deaths of these children. I would add, the reason I asked you how the sperm was collected, because from my knowledge, a lot of times, and maybe if I don't even know if this all the time, it's in a sexually immoral way.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
There's pornography
Yeah.
involved,
Yep.
and
That's been my
so
understanding.
I mean, you just add that on top of the thing. That's like the well.
Yeah.
So let's go back. Talk about playing God. What so is it? Make the case for why it's wrong. Let's say, are you making? Let's make the easy case
All
first,
right.
and then go to the hard case.
Sure.
Let's make the case for life beginning at conception and killing a human being that's not a criminal is wrong. Let's make that case biblically,
Sure.
because I think the harder case will be that it's wrong, even if that was not the case.
That's right.
Sure.
Sure.
So make the case for us, life beginning at conception, or use scripture, use what God's revealed even in nature if you want.
Sure.
Just make that case for us.
Okay. Sure. So, all right. Let's see here. Well,
I know it's
first
kind
of
of
all,
broad.
yeah, that's okay. We'll start with conception. I mean, there's various ways you can do this, but I think going to the account of Mary visiting Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1 is a good place, because we read, if you go to verse 39 of Luke 1, that Mary went to visit Elizabeth, and when she said hello, John the Baptist leaped in Elizabeth's womb, and Elizabeth says, "Blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" And so, for behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. So what you have, I believe what you have here is you have John the Baptist, who's still in his mother's womb, giving worship to Jesus. Jesus is an embryo at this time. From the description of the passage, we don't know exactly the timing of Mary's visit. Like, how many days did it take her to get to Judah from Nazareth? Well,
Yeah. So when the angel visits her, the Annunciation, she's not pregnant yet.
She's not pregnant yet.
And somewhere between there to her going to Elizabeth,
Yeah.
which seems to me immediately in the account, she
right.
immediately goes.
Immediately goes.
And we're talking what? How far of a trip is she going? Like, a 30-day trip, a round the world trip? Where
I can't remember, but I don't think it's not a 30-day trip. This is just a few days journey, if memory serves. Maybe a week, but less, also possibly.
Yeah, somewhere it had to be within that kind of a
Right.
realm. I guess tradition shows where she went to was, not quite that very far
Right.
away. So we're not talking about even from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We're talking,
Yes.
not even that far.
Yes. And so what you have is you have John the Baptist, I believe, worshiping Jesus, but Jesus is just an embryo, because this is right after after the Holy Spirit overshadows Mary. Mary conceives. Then Jesus is still an embryo. Maybe he hasn't even yet implanted in the uterine wall. Don't know. I mean, if you go back a little bit earlier in Luke's account, if you go back to the Annunciation itself, it says, the angel says, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son. Well, that language is that's the language of conception. That's the language of, now there's a son, because there's an embryonic person where there wasn't before. There's just a presumption in these accounts of, well, did you conceive? Well, you didn't conceive a pre-son, like a thing, a lump of flesh that will be a son one day. You conceived a son, He's already a person, John the Baptist. And Mary, the same thing is going to happen to you. And then when Mary goes, Elizabeth is filled with joy. Why? Because the mother of my Lord has come to me. And this is a way of talking that makes sense if the Lord is present. Because she says, "Blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb." The Lord is present in Mary's womb. And that explains Elizabeth's joy. That explains the pre-born John the Baptist's joy.
Yeah. And so you're even from your first week, couple weeks before anybody would even detect a pregnancy,
Right.
Jesus, Elizabeth recognizes by the power of the Holy Spirit, and
Yes.
John the Baptist,
Yes.
who is in the womb himself, recognizes.
Yes.
And so we know then that that the scriptures consider his life at very, 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 very early.
Yes.
And then you got to, I've been thinking about this, Ben.
Yeah.
But you think about what we say in the Nicene Creed or the Chalcedonian Creed about the very nature of Christ, that he is fully God, fully man. And it's indivisible. And so there was never a point in which there was cells and then the Son of God, the divinity came upon that.
Right.
So at the very beginning of Jesus, as a single cell, the divinity of God and the human nature are together, are united in that sense.
Yes.
And so, and they're indivisible. There's two natures, but indivisible from the very beginning, which means the divinity of God's not just hovering over a clump of cells, if you will.
Right. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we've always considered Jesus to be the church historically has always considered Jesus to be there from the moment that Mary was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit. He was conceived, and he was there. You think that's good enough as a biblical reason?
Well, you could say, well, Jesus was a special case, but then you also have John the Baptist there too.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, no, I mean, I think that you can't get really a better example. Then you can pile on the Old Testament passages about being formed in the womb and all that. But what better example than the example of our Savior?
Yeah.
And so would we discard his embryo?
Right.
Freeze him, or
right.
Yeah, right. Whatever one you did to the least of these, you did to me.
Yes.
So okay. All right. I'm convinced. What's the argument against that, Ben?
Against conception?
Yeah, what we just said is what would be the argument against it?
Oh man, I mean, you'd have to say, well, the biblical writers are ignorant. They're just, or well, no, you wouldn't do that if you were clever. What you say is, well, they had a certain way of speaking, but we shouldn't confuse that for their attempt to be scientifically precise. They're not giving their opinion on when life begins. They're talking more about the outcome of things. But I think that's goofy. I mean, I think the whole way that even David talks in, say, Psalm 139 about being formed by God in the hidden place.
I read that. Yeah.
Yeah. And or even when David says, "Surely I was born in sin, and sin my mother conceived me." Well, there's the idea that you know, that I was conceived. Like sin is attributed. We could attribute sin to me from the moment of my conception. Like it seems like they understand what they're talking about. You know,
Yeah.
it just I've never looked into any technical arguments for or against the idea that the Bible writers are being precise when they use that word conceived. I haven't looked at the Hebrew or Latin or Greek words, but it just seems clear from the way that they talk that they understand that hidden thing that happens in the womb when the parents make love that leads to conception, and there you are. It's you. It's a person.
Sounds a little bit like we're a little chronological snobbery a lot of times pushing, or they were so ignorant, could not have
Yeah.
ever have understood anything
Yeah.
like that. But then you realize that there was also contraception being used. A lot of times the word witchcraft and stuff in the Old Testament was dealing with
Right.
potions to stop the birth of children, abortifacients, and so
Yes.
even similar stuff that we use that is used now.
Yes.
And so yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the scriptures then are clear. Life begins at conception. Jesus was born in conception.
Mm-hmm.
This from there is pretty easy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the argument I want to make.
Yeah.
Well, what about we're not trying to murder. This isn't abortion. It's not like we're trying to stop it. We want to have children.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
And so, what do you say to that?
Yeah. Yeah. You could say this isn't abortion. This isn't even hormonal contraception that can kill a child, because okay. IVF is people trying to have kids. That's what it's for. All right.
And that's good, man. Our fertility rates are so terribly low, and I mean, we need people to have children, and we love women,
Mm-hmm.
and it'd be barbaric for us to stop that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, who are we to tell a pregnant woman, or not? I mean, a barren woman,
Yes,
that she can't get pregnant.
Right. Well, I mean, for starters, we're not telling her that. That's where she's at, and we should help her any way we could. But the only question is, should we sin in helping her? So, kind of the easy reason to tell someone that IVF is sinful to participate in is that it always has and always does, with I think very rare exceptions, take lives. That participating in this process puts lots of children at risk. And the risk could even be this, like, what if you are like, well, we love children, we believe that every embryo that gets fertilized, gets created, is a person made in the image of God. And we are going to, even if we create 15 of them, we're going to have them all. We're committed. Let's say you have that commitment and you create the children and then you die. Are you not guilty of putting your children in a place where they will be without a mother, where they will be unable to be born? Are you not guilty? How can you say that you love your children when you are taking their future entirely into your hands? Do you really think, do you have a guarantee from God that you will live to give birth to these children? You don't. Who are you to take the future of your children from conception to implantation into your hands? That is something you actually cannot control. And so if you create these children, you admit that you have put them at risk of death. Why would you put anyone's life at risk? You don't do this in your normal life. You don't say, well, I you don't you don't say in other situations that the end justifies the means, right? You don't say that I'm justified in putting your life at risk because I have a good goal. Yeah, um, I've got to I've got to get home and spend time with my kids, so I'm going to go 150 miles an hour down the highway. I'm going to put everyone's life at risk, but it's for a good goal. And I hope I don't kill anyone. I hope I don't cause any accidents. But at the end of the day, I'm doing it for my kids, and I got to get home. That's a dumb example. There's good examples. I just can't pull one. Um, but the point is that we all understand that we're not allowed to put people's lives at risk, even if we have good ends in mind. As Christians, that's wrong to do. And so, if you love your kids, but you're putting all of their lives at risk, then I question the nature of your love. And I think actually what you love is yourself. And I think you have taken this natural desire for children, and your desire for children has risen to a level above your desire to protect the life of your children, because inherent to the process is that you're not. Why? Because you can't. You cannot protect their lives. You will put them in a situation that is, by its very nature, insecure, simply by participating in this process. You cannot control your own destiny, which means you cannot control theirs. But you put them in that situation. And if they die, for that reason, I believe it's on you, as well as the embryologist. It's on you. And you have to reckon with that. You have to reckon with the fact that you're being driven by something other than love of your children, because if you love them, you would not risk their lives. And that indicates that something else is going on here. And that's why I think it's appropriate to say that you're playing God. That's one reason, at least.
Well, let's talk about
Yeah.
that. I want to play devil's advocate with some of the things you've
Sure.
said, but before I do, so we've already we've made the case life begins at conception.
Yeah.
I mean, we can look at 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. We can make that case pretty well, especially if you've listened to the show before where we talk about abortion.
Yeah.
But let's talk about playing God, because this is where I think this is where people may have the most objections.
Yeah.
With the argument.
Sure.
And yet I think it might be some of the most important part of the argument. So let's get into it. Again, I'm gonna give the thing, right?
Yeah.
That's for the sake of the argument, assume that I'm only going to have one or two embryos fertilized, and I'm going to make use of them. If not, I already have it lined up for somebody to adopt. Like, trying to get rid of your objection regarding that. What's wrong with that? What's the problem? And how am I playing God? What's wrong with?
So give me your scenario set up again.
Okay. I agree with you 100%. We are not going to murder children.
Okay.
Children's life begins at conception.
Okay. Yep.
And so we're only going to do a couple.
Yeah.
And we're planning on having both. And if not, I've already got somebody lined up to adopt the one of them. Okay. So they're going to be born.
Okay.
That's as far as I can. And then I'll throw this objection on top. This is just technology too. Like, God gave us the ability to come up with this technology. And so, are you saying then we shouldn't make use of good technology? Like, are you a Luddite?
Sure.
Sure. You almost have an Amish beard. So, like, what's playing God about this? Tell me all that.
Okay, sure. I mean, technology really depends on the ends for which it's used, right? And technology, just because technology can do something, I mean, God gave us the ability to create all kinds of technologies. We can kill millions of people at scale with atomic bombs. That doesn't tell us whether or not we ought to use it, but we know that we could. I mean, and we know that we have. Now, whether we should is a different question. So I don't think saying it's just technology gets us anywhere. So that's just my preliminary comment there. As to why it's playing God, well, I'll go back to the argument I was just making for a second. I don't know how you can get around the idea that putting your kids in a situation where they could die, at a completely vulnerable, in a way that's not appropriate to the level of risk they ought to be taking. Like, you could say, yeah, I'm going to sign this waiver so that my son can go water skiing. Well, your son could die. He could drown. Something horrible could happen. The boat could explode. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Well, everyone understands there's risk everywhere, and our job as parents is to try and keep the appropriate level of risk in our child's lives. We don't want them to have no risk. That's foolish. We don't want them to have all the risk. That's foolish too. When they're adults, when they move out of our home, they take on a new level of risk and responsibility, and that's appropriate. And we try to train them to that point so they can manage it for themselves. But I don't put my, maybe I let my 10-year-old even water ski. Probably so. Sounds great. But I'm not going to let my 2-year-old water ski. I'm not going to sign that waiver. Why? Because that level of risk for him would mean certain death. He can't swim. He can't hold on to the skis. He can't balance. And for that reason, it would be criminal of me as a parent to expose him to that level of risk, right? So we have to tailor the risks we allow our kids to take to their level of vulnerability and ability.
Mm-hmm.
And so we apply that to the current situation. You say you want to do IVF. Well, IVF is going to create any number of babies. And let's say that you're able to, use the more precise technology and you only create 2, which I think is what you said at first. You want to. So let's say you're able to do that. Okay. You only created 2. All right. You've now paid to have 2 children created. And these children are exposed to a level of risk because you put them in a situation through commissioning them, right? Their creation, that's unnatural. And the risk is, well, they're not meant actually originally to develop in petri dishes or test tubes. They're not meant to be fertilized and grow that way. And so once they're fertilized, they're at a risk of death just because it's abnormal. They're made for the safety and warmth of a woman's body. That's their normal place of development and growth. So you've already put them in a circumstance that is difficult for them and compromised them in that way. Let's say that they both live in spite of what you've done to put them there. Well, there's other risks now, because if you have one of them transferred to your wife to give birth to, or that's the hope, and you have one of them frozen, that's another risk. The freezing process is imperfect. And some embryos don't survive it. Now, I think many more do than don't. But all we're talking about is whether or not it's right to subject someone at a stage of absolute helplessness, which does describe an embryo, much more helpless than my 2-year-old son, even, to situations that are dangerous and could end their lives. Is it not the heart of playing God to decide that we can do with other people what we like? Then we have to ask again the reason for all this. And the reason that we come to for your entering IVF is that you want a child. Now, there's no sin in wanting a child. It's good to want children, and children are a beautiful thing and a gift from God. But it's not right. It's not right to have children at any cost. And if the cost is that you have acted um, against the responsibility God gave you as a parent to protect your children's lives by placing them in danger, then I think we've entered the what we've entered into is the way a consumer thinks. Well, I want this product and I can buy it. I want it and I'll buy it. But a husband and wife don't think that way like consumers when they're, having sex. The idea is that our love in marriage leads on to children because God has chosen to order things that way. And as soon as I remove having kids from a context of we made love and we had kids, then I've created an unnatural situation because I have become like a consumer paying for a product. And like I've been saying earlier in this podcast, you can see that in the way it operates. You can see that in the argument I was just making where you put your kids at risk in order to have kids.
Mhm.
You can see that in the fact that you suddenly have all these bizarre decisions to make about your children. Do I freeze them? For how long? Do I let someone else adopt them? Do I give them to science? Do I throw some of them away? All of these things are options. And they're not just options because our society is perverse, although it is. They're options because this technology leads rather naturally to those decisions. And I don't mean we couldn't reform it. We've already been talking about micro IVF or mini IVF, where you have many fewer babies created. You could also further reform it, let's say, with a Christian IVF agency, which there are some, a lab, which says, well, we don't donate babies to science. If an embryo dies, we bury it and we have a little funeral service. Okay, that can be done. But you're still, as a parent, in a place of playing God by putting your kids into a situation that is dangerous to them, where they are vulnerable, and that isn't natural. It isn't the natural God-ordained kind of vulnerability. Because in the womb, who knows what could happen? Maybe there's a problem with your wife's uterus that you and she don't know about. But you're not. But these things are the natural context of risk that God places your children in. You didn't create a hostile environment, let's assume, for that embryo. You wanted to have it. And if the embryo doesn't make it, if you have sex, your wife conceives, and that little embryo doesn't make it, and let's say you never even know that he lived, right? He never made it to a stage where you could even tell that she was pregnant. God knows, and you're not responsible for that little one's death because God put that situation there and set it up and ordered it in such a way that that he's responsible. But as soon as you take the process of conception out of that context and control it, I would say, now you're responsible. You want to freeze your babies? You're going to make that choice? You realize if they die, it's on you. No one asked you to create these babies. You paid to have them created. And maybe I better stop there and see what you say.
No, that's good. I guess what I would maybe we transition to. I think you've made a good argument there
Okay.
I imagine what people will push back on is simply our intentions are
Mm-hmm.
good.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and then you keep making a statement. Maybe this would be
Sure.
helpful. It might take us down a rabbit trail a little bit,
All
but
right.
like you keep saying it's unnatural.
Yes.
There's all kinds of stuff that we do that's not necessarily natural,
Yes.
that aren't necessarily immoral.
Right. Right. Very true.
Like me wearing glasses
Yes.
is not natural in a sense of.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that? Not natural, and why does that make it therefore immoral?
Yes. That's a very good question, and I should be more precise, I think. So, well, yes, there's plenty of things we all do that aren't natural in the certain sense of the word, but they are natural in terms of man is created to take dominion and subdue the earth, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
why do we have glasses? Why can you wear glasses that correct your eyesight? Well, because we're obeying God's natural order, which is to take dominion and subdue the earth. And so it's not natural in the sense that your glasses didn't grow on a tree, but it is natural in the sense that it is what God created mankind to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I use the word unnatural, what I mean is that it's against what God created us to do.
It's against the nature of the thing.
Yeah. It's against the nature of the thing itself, or the nature of man. And I would say God has given us dominion over the world, and we're supposed to make all kinds of discoveries and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field and all the things he talks about in Genesis. Excuse me. But I think, but there are areas we can go into that aren't natural. There are things we can do that spit in God's face. There are things we can do that go against the grain of the world, that are perverse and wrong. If you there's certain sins I could name. There's, for instance, homosexuality or bestiality. These are sexual sins that involve a perversion of the natural order, right?
Yep.
And just because those things are biologically possible to do doesn't make them natural. They're unnatural. And so, in kind of a similar vein, I believe that IVF is unnatural because of what I'm saying. It's almost like I'm using the word as a synonym for playing God in this case.
Mm-hmm.
It's unnatural because God established the way that children are created, which is, and of course, I've been saying, they get created in a lab. Well, we know that God creates all children, even the ones that are fertilized in a lab. God's creating them. They came into existence that way through God's providence. And they're fully human, fully in the image of God. So God creates the children who come to be through IVF, and God creates the children who come to be in the womb. God creates all of them. But the way that God set up creation is that he hid the process of conception. He hid it in 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 the things that happen as a man and a woman make love, that lead on to a sperm fertilizing an egg. You can't see that happening normally. You can't see a sperm fertilizing an egg because it's inside the body of the woman that happens after marriage. And and um and we know in Psalm 139, David says that God wove him together. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. And so there is built into nature is the way that we have children, and we know that that's important because men, unlike animals, have the image of God, and we're not just bodies, we're souls. And we know that we can't create souls. We know that God must create our souls, and that He's creating a soul for every person who's ever lived, right? That hidden spiritual part of us.
Mm-hmm.
That's also hidden. That's hidden because we can't manipulate or see spirit or soul.
Yep.
And what I'm saying is that as you consider these things, I think it's evident that God hid them both. He hid, obviously, his creation of soul because it's in a hidden realm. But he even hid the conception of a man or woman, because men and women are made in his image and they belong to him, and he saw fit to hide them and make the process invisible to us, the process of conception. And he chose also to design things so that we don't have direct control, because children belong to him, because all men belong to him, right? We bear his image. That means we're his property. And we're not one another's property. And so because God hid these things, and because God didn't give us control, direct control, because we can't be sure that when we make love, we're going to have a baby. Can't make sure. There's no way to ensure that. That's always in God's hands, which is a major theme of the Bible. I think these things show us that God owns this process, and he doesn't see fit to give it to us. I think the more that you consider the hiddenness and the I wouldn't say out of controlledness, but I'd say there's a word I'm sure that's just not coming to mind. Not randomness, but the hiddenness of the process and the limits of our control of conception. That
Because it's still even in the IVF, we don't have perfect control over it.
No. That's why so many
And
die.
what happens is when we try to take control over things. This is what happens when you play God with stuff.
Yes.
It gets out of control, even more so. Right?
That's
like
right.
you think you have things in control, but as we've already said, how many? At least 500 just to get the thing rolling were killed. And now, as we're looking at a million at least, or several million. What was it? 100 million? 100 million.
112 million
baby
dead. Yeah.
Dead in the process and counting. And we haven't even talked about the uses of this thing now being for other immoral purposes, like designer babies or sodomites having children and then abusing them.
Yes.
And
Yep. I mean, part of it, Joseph, is as simple as, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. And the smoke, in this case, is all the dead babies and the other immoral things that you're just mentioning now. That's a lot of smoke. Maybe, when there's all this smoke with abortion, we trace abortion back to playing God, right? It's murder. Yes, but all murder eventually is linked to playing God. Well, if there's all these dead babies, and if we don't quite want to call it murder in a lot of cases, right? It's like the deaths are an unintended side effect, although that's only true sometimes, right? Sometimes it's simply murder in the IVF world. But even so, where there's smoke, there's fire. How do you get 112 million dead children without someone playing God? I don't know how you get there. All the commandments tie back to the first commandment: you shall have no other gods before me. And you can't avoid that.
Yeah. And it's like as soon as you start prying into these hidden things, there's consequences.
And
And we talked about that. I asked you the question. We don't even know yet. We don't know what, if there may be, maybe there won't be, but the consequences of being frozen for 30 years
Yes.
and then being born.
Yeah. We don't know.
What effect, if any, does that have? And then there's like psychological impact, right? What if when these children find out how they were conceived? Now, not many people tell their children.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this. You don't tell your children how they were conceived. I don't want to know how I was conceived. Don't tell me. I don't know the circumstances. But in these things, they do find out.
Yeah.
Or I wonder, has there ever been a case of mistaken embryos placed in the wrong people?
I think there probably has been. I can't remember if I've read about a story exactly, but
I feel like there was. So you're getting stuff like that.
Yes.
You're, I mean, if this doctor just was willing to use his own DNA, I can imagine a scenario that comes out in the future where some doctor actually used his DNA the entire time.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, it reminds me of, I wish I could remember where this was, but I want to say it's in 2 Kings. Do you remember, I think it's one of the kings of Israel is fighting a pagan king. And they're winning the battle against the pagan king. But then the pagan king, it says, sacrifices his son. And then there's great wrath against Israel, and Israel has to withdraw. Yeah. I always think of that story because I think, look, there's a reason that you sacrificed your kids as a Canaanite, right? And it wasn't just because you were purely evil or stupid. It's because there are demonic powers in the world that respond positively. They're happy at the bloodshed of innocence. They're happy. It has power. And so that's why I'd like to refer to this sometimes as a black magic technology, much as I would stem cell research, right? Or any scientific research advanced through the sale of fetal body parts from Planned Parenthood. Black magic technology. It turns out we can build a lot of powerful technology if we're willing to kill lots of children. Guess what? It's always been true that you could get power and money that way.
Mm-hmm. And abstemiously on good things down the line, right? Like we have vaccines that have done good that have been on the backs of little children that were murdered.
Yeah, and it's horrible to think of. I mean, you think of all that.
So
go ahead.
That leads me. I want to spend the remainder of our time then, Ben. I think we've made a good case. Maybe there's some people, and if they have questions, they can talk to you.
Sure.
We'll give them your follow up. But that's for the sake of our argument, listener. If you're not convinced, let's assume that you are. And so that's sake of the argument here. We've made the case. Now what? All right. So what do you say, first of all, to the couple that they did this? What do you say? What's the? Because I mean, this and maybe they didn't have a clue. I mean, they just knew they wanted to have children. They froze babies or they had them discarded or whatever. Like, this has got to be like weighty. What do you do? What do you tell them?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that, Joseph, because I haven't approached things from that angle at all. So let me just say, I think you have to understand, just as you would if you were witnessing to someone going to get an abortion, you have to understand that organizations that kill babies or practices like IVF that turn parents into consumers are feeding off vulnerability. You catch people in a time of crisis. You catch them when they're afraid or desperate. You catch parents who can't have kids, and they feel the pain and grief of that. And you say, look, I can help you. I mean, it's expensive, but I can help you have a baby. That's a good pitch. And at that point, as soon as you buy that pitch, I would say, what I say to these parents is, look, I understand you wanted children, and I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. Children are wonderful. God wants us to want them. But I'm afraid that what you've done in going about it this way is you have ended up putting your children in a vulnerable position that God never intended you to do. And you have taken some certain powers that belong to God, and turned into more of a consumer of kids. Turn your kids into a consumer product simply by the act of paying for them, like this. Um, that's where I would begin, somewhere like that.
Hmm.
Um,
A passage of scripture that just came to mind
yeah.
as you were saying all this that we didn't even think about. Maybe,
Mm,
I don't know if it ever has come to your mind,
mm.
is Sarah and Abraham, and Sarah wanting a child so much
Yes.
that she goes about it
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
way that was ultimately sinful, and
yes.
the impacts from that. And yet Sarah is in heaven, so
Right.
there is hope. Right.
Yeah,
That's what I yeah. So like
absolutely.
but it starts what with acknowledging
Yeah, it starts with
the
that's
sinfulness.
right. It starts with acknowledging that what you've done is to participate in something that's actually very dark. Um, I think realizing for most parents that you, they've these are their precious children, and they did put them in a situation that was vulnerable. They didn't protect their children.
Hmm.
They paid to put them in a dangerous situation, and they need to understand. They need to have that connected to their life. Like, would you let your 2-year-old water ski? Or pick your own example. Well, of course not. Well, would you? Would you? Pull it back. Would you let your baby who was just born stoke the fire? Well, no. That's dumb. Like, I wouldn't put my baby anywhere near the fire. It's just a baby. Okay. Well, would you put your children at their most helpless in a place where they could die? No. Well, but aren't your embryos your children? And didn't you? And haven't they been since because you created them in a lab? Haven't they been in a place where they were totally vulnerable, could not protect themselves, and actually, they didn't even have the protection of your womb?
Hmm.
Now, I've never had this conversation with someone, and I'm just trying to think of this as I go along, Joseph. But I think these are some ideas for how you start. If I think these are hard conversations to have, um,
Yeah.
because, but we do need to begin having them, and we do need to make sure that, like you're saying, Sarah's in heaven. Like people need to see the guilt of their sin and this matter, and participating in this, multi-billion-dollar industry, and they need to turn to the blood of Jesus as the solution. Um,
Yeah. There's always the cheap grace that doesn't help anybody.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, it's fine. Sarah's in heaven. There's a way to say that. It's like, well,
right,
then keep on doing it, man. Keep on trucking because Sarah's in
right, right,
heaven.
right,
Like,
right.
you need to do this. It'll be fine. That's not what we're
No,
saying. But what we're saying, because that's not a comfort for the proud and to
right,
continue to trample under the blood of
right.
Jesus. It's a comfort for those who have heard this and are like, what have we done?
Yes, that's right.
And in that case, it's like, whew, that's heavy. And
It's
that's what
heavy.
you have to that's heavy with abortion. That's heavy with it should be with any of our sin, right? We ought to mourn. Like when I think I don't have abortion or IVF in my past, but I have other sins
Mm,
of heavy weight, and I sin still, and my sin is
mm,
if you were to categorize it in human terms, maybe not the same weight as some of this other stuff, but like in the past for
hmm.
sure. And
Yeah.
yet it's still all heavy, like in the sense of it deserves the condemnation of God.
Hmm.
And the littlest of sins have consequences. I keep thinking of I'm preaching through first and second Samuel,
Hmm. Hmm.
and just the consequences of Saul's little sins
Oh yeah.
and how much they weigh. And so you got to think, we don't know. I mean, I doubt any person that we know that would have had an IVF is sitting there, even have contemplated the idea of 117 million children
Yeah.
put to death, and they may have contributed to that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would. If you hear this, you need to be pierced to your heart, but you need to then fall on your knees before the Lord, is what I would encourage, and
Mm-hmm.
keep going to God for grace and mercy.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and then I would probably, a good conversation would be had with your pastor or elder, somebody else that you trust. We can confess our sins straight to the Father through Jesus. But I think there are some sins that, not that we're Roman Catholics here, but some sins that are of a nature that you don't need to carry them alone, and
Mm-hmm.
to take them to your pastor and elder, or somebody that you trust,
Yeah.
and have them help you. Ben,
Mm.
okay, what do you say then to like somebody that wants to have children? They've been considering this. Is there
Mm.
are there other methods, fertility treatments and stuff that don't amount to playing God and don't fall into this category?
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. There's stuff as simple as tracking women's periods, stuff like the Creighton method. The Roman Catholics, once again, have been ahead of us in developing some of these things. And that can help. But then there's other, who knows, there's supplements, there's surgeries to remove scar tissue. There's all kinds of things to look into. There's things to look into about
Are there
male sperm
medications
counts.
and stuff?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, my wife and I, we were trying to get through infertility for several years of marriage, our first years of marriage, and trying to have children and couldn't. It was very hard, and we tried a number of things and ended up with a Roman Catholic doctor who would never, for that reason, would never push us toward IVF, which we didn't want. Um,
Hmm.
and so I don't know all the ins and outs, but there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things you could do, and then of course you could look at adoption, which we looked at. But at some point, in considering natural adoption, regular adoption, which adopting an infant, we began to look into embryo adoption, and that's the route we ended up taking. And embryo adoption is something that infertile couples ought to consider, especially if your wife, well, if you adopt a baby as an embryo, then the doctor will put it in your wife's womb, hoping it will implant. And that means your wife has the opportunity to carry her child, even though it's adoption. And that's a very sweet opportunity to have. My wife is very grateful that she's been able to carry our children. Embryo adoption, excuse me, isn't done by a lot of agencies, but there are some Christian agencies that do it. And like,
So what do you say, Ben, that like would somebody you're being a hypocrite then with making use of this thing,
right.
or you're you're enabling the
Right.
thing?
You're enabling the thing. Yeah. I would just say, look, it's as simple as this. Christians have always lived in contexts, in societies that shed innocent blood and that treated people like property. And we have stepped in to love and rescue. Like we rescued babies that were abandoned in ancient Rome because the fathers exercised their right to kill their children and put the babies outside the city walls for the animals to eat. And Christians would rescue these children and raise them, and that's love. That's love. Adoption is love. It's the same love that got us into the family of Jesus. The Father adopted us and rescued us. And so the only real question is it love to rescue these children? I think that's it. I think you can acknowledge the darkness of the whole thing without participating in that darkness, because you're not having more babies created, and it's adoption, so the parents aren't getting paid. You know, you're not paying any parents to make babies, make embryos for you to have in adoption. Um,
What's the, sorry to ask
yeah,
the question, the legal thing? Because you said there wasn't a lot of regulations.
right. Yeah.
So through normal adoption, there's I guess, a court hearing. They're
Hmm.
legally your children.
Yes.
Does that happen in this case?
Well, not in the same way, no, because legally there is no state, as I understand it currently, in which embryo adoption is adoption. In other words, adoption is what it really is, but legally, it's just property transfer, and for that reason, if you sign a contract to adopt kids, to adopt embryos, what you're really doing is signing a property transfer contract, so the children become your property. And that's sad, but um, we went through an agency that does treat the process as adoption, and they require, for instance, a home study. So, and I think that's great, but a home study isn't legally required. Um, it's just what they
What's the
require.
say? What's the, you may not even know. What's the say you give birth to the children, and now the biological parents don't show up?
Well, it doesn't matter because it's transfer of property. It's actually pretty cut and dried. Um, the embryos were your property while they were embryos, and now that the children are born, um, they're just yours. Their
Okay.
status is yours, as as much as your biological children or considered your children under the law.
Are your names on their birth certificates?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, man, we've spent a good amount of time on this.
Yeah.
We're starting to get Joe Rogan territory. You got another hour in you.
I don't know, man.
No. But what's final thoughts, man? Anything you feel like we haven't really dealt well with that we need to cover?
I don't know. We went over a whole lot together, didn't we? We covered a lot of ground. I feel like I hope people are interested in this. I hope they want to do a little more reading. And I know you could suggest some places they could read. I could too. But in the show notes, maybe we could put like some years ago, my friends Jake and Nathan and I, back when the Sound of Sanity podcast was still producing stuff, we did a 3-part series on the fertility industry. That goes it's a broader take on the fertility industry.
Mm-hmm.
It does focus a lot on IVF, but IVF is not all we talk about. And so,
and it's a pretty scripted show. Like,
yeah,
it's kind of a more of a
that's right.
I don't want to say it's more of a show than an interview.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yep.
absolutely, yes. And that's helpful. Abortion and the Church, which is a book published by Evangel Presbytery, and it's free online, is an excellent resource, and it has one section that's very dense with statistics about IVF.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some other things too, some articles I've mentioned that I'll send you, Joseph. But I don't know what else to say without just going into a whole other area of this stuff. but I don't know that I have that in me now. Like we didn't really touch on, say, surrogacy or sperm and egg donation and what that means. But
Oh
those
yeah,
are,
yeah. There's quite a
there's
bit
a
of.
lot of other stuff.
I mean, we barely. I mean, really, we can get quite deep, more so than even this.
Oh man.
So, but well, hey Ben, I think this has been certainly informative, convicting in a sense of just this goes on in our land without much thought.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
these are the issues of our day that we're dealing with. Is the issue of life and us playing God. I this past Sunday was preaching 2 Samuel 1 and spent a long time talking about assisted suicide because it too it's the other side of the coin on this,
Yeah.
playing God. And
Yeah.
the same kind of legal things are going on regarding it. It is quite amazing as I research some of the same arguments are made for both things, and the same kind of people support them, support the ability to take life and I guess try to give life.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole thing is it's a lack of fear of the Lord.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
as Christians, we fear God. We acknowledge His ways, and when you think about you look at maybe a final thing to think about is with the barrenness, the infertility in the Bible, it is an affliction. In our day, a lot of people intentionally make themselves infertile and think of it as a gift to be able to do so.
Yeah.
And then you have ones that want to have children, people, and it is such an affliction, such a painful thing. And even having this conversation, it's very, very painful. And you see that in the scripture often, over and over again, with with Sarai, Hannah, and Elizabeth. And yet they teach us the way. The way is the relying on the Lord.
Yes.
And that's the difference between Hannah and Sarah. Sarah took a matter in her own hands, and she did get God's grace. But Hannah just pled to the Lord and cried out to the Lord, and everybody thought she was crazy. And God did provide in His time. And it may be that talking to the mothers here, the mothers that want to be mothers, that God provides in this life. I've known people that thought they were infertile and then God provided. Or it may be that God provides children in other ways that doesn't necessarily take away that pain. But, the scriptures talk about one of the fruits of the gospel, one of the prophecies of the Old Testament is that the barren woman would have more children than the fertile woman, right? That she will have, I think it's talking about the church, but I think there's prophecy of the idea is true that a Christian lady that gives herself to loving the church has many, many children.
Yes.
And how much better it is then to trust in the Lord, rely on His mercy and grace, and to cling to Him in affliction, and then Him provide in your weakness all of His strength, and your hands are clean from the bloodshed, and you get to lift up holy hands to the Lord. How much better?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Ben, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, they had questions about this, and maybe they want to get a hold of you and just wring your neck because they don't agree. What how do they do so? How do they get a hold of you?
Oh, they could email me.
All right.
So they could email me at let's see, benjamin.j.sulser. So that's SULSER@gmail.com.
All right, Benjamin J. Sulser at gmail.com.
Yep.
And well, Ben, I have been blessed having you on the show, and I just always appreciate talking to you and enjoy you. So,
Thanks for having me.
thank you for coming.
I've been really enjoyed talking with you, Joseph. It's a good discussion.